The Sears Tower was completed in 1973 as the tallest building in the world, a title it held for 25 years. Sears, Roebuck and Company built it in Chicago's West Loop as the global headquarters of what was then the largest retailer in the United States, a company whose catalog sales, store network, and brand recognition had made it, for most of the 20th century, the most consequential retail institution in American commercial history. Sears sold the building in 1994. The company that had built the world's tallest skyscraper to house its corporate operations had, within 20 years of the building's completion, concluded that it no longer needed or could financially justify occupying the physical infrastructure it had constructed as a monument to its own institutional permanence. The building was renamed Willis Tower in 2009, when Willis Group Holdings, a British insurance broker, acquired the naming rights as part of its lease agreement for a portion of the building's office space. The name change generated substantial public resistance in Chicago, where the building's identity as the Sears Tower had been so thoroughly embedded in the city's cultural geography that the corporate renaming was treated as an act of institutional trespass rather than as the routine execution of a naming rights agreement. The forensic entry point for this case is not the architectural history of the building, though that history is consequential and instructive. The forensic entry point is the specific mechanism by which the company that built the world's tallest skyscraper was simultaneously building the business model conditions that would make continued occupancy of that skyscraper financially untenable, and the relationship between the building's survival and the company's eventual bankruptcy filing that Case File 053 will examine in detail. The Sears Tower still stands. The Sears Company does not, in any form that would recognize its 1973 self. The building outlasted the institution, but the institution's decline was visible in the decision to sell the building to decades before the company's bankruptcy, and the forensic record of that decision contains the earliest documented evidence of the institutional failure that the bankruptcy would eventually confirm. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. Sears, Roebuck and Company's decision to build the Sears Tower in the early 1970s was an act of corporate confidence whose timing was almost precisely wrong. The building was conceived and approved in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the period of Sears's maximum institutional confidence, when the company's dominance of American retail appeared so complete and so durable that a permanent global headquarters of unprecedented scale seemed not merely justified, but obligatory. The competitive disruption that would eventually destroy that dominance was already developing when the building's steel frame was rising above the Chicago skyline. Kmart had opened its first discount stores in 1962. Walmart had opened its first store in 1962. The discount retail format that those two companies were developing, which competed with Sears's general merchandise stores on price rather than on selection or service, would prove to be the most consequential structural disruption in the history of American retail. Sears built the world's tallest building as Walmart was building the business model that would make Sears irrelevant. The covenant that Sears's leadership did not read carefully enough was the one written into the discount retail format's unit economics, a store model whose lower cost structure allowed it to price general merchandise at margins that the Sears model could not match without restructuring a cost base that the Sears Tower and the institutional overhead it represented had been designed to support. The building's annual occupancy cost alone represented a fixed expense that a company losing market share to lower-cost competitors was progressively less able to justify. The decision to sell the tower in 1994 was therefore not merely a real estate transaction. It was a documented acknowledgement by Sears's management that the cost structure the building represented was incompatible with the competitive reality that the company faced. The sale generated approximately $850 million in proceeds that Sears used to fund other corporate initiatives, a monetization of the building's real estate value that provided short-term financial relief without addressing the structural competitive problem that had made the building's continued ownership untenable. The building was the symptom of the institutional failure. The real estate transaction was not the cure. At what point does a company's decision to sell its headquarters building signal an institutional failure that the transaction itself cannot remedy? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal that governed Sears's 1994 sale of the Sears Tower produced a transaction price of approximately $850 million, a figure that reflected the building's status as the tallest and most recognizable commercial tower in the Western Hemisphere, and its position in the Chicago Loop office market as a destination address for major corporate tenants. The appraisal correctly valued what the building was as a real estate asset. It was analytically irrelevant to the institutional failure that the sale represented, because the institutional failure was not a function of the building's real estate value. It was a function of the competitive displacement that Walmart and Kmart were executing in the general merchandise retail market that Sears had dominated. The forensic parallel with the Chrysler Building case documented in Case File 0-2 is instructive here. Both cases document buildings whose cultural authority and architectural significance consistently generate acquisition interest at premium real estate valuations, while the institutions that built those buildings experience financial difficulties that the building's real estate values could not address. The Chrysler Building's cultural authority allowed successive owners to borrow against valuations that the building's operating cash flows could not service, producing the perpetual underwater debt structure that Case File 0-2 documented. The Sears Tower's cultural authority generated $850 million sale price that provided Sears with capital that it deployed in corporate initiatives without resolving the competitive displacement that had made the building's continued ownership untenable. In both cases, the building's real estate value was genuine and the institutional failure was genuine, and the two facts existed independently of each other. The Sears Tower sale is the forensic record of a corporation that had confused its real estate asset with its institutional strength. The building was worth $850 million because it was a great building in a great location. The company was worth progressively less because it was losing ground to a more efficient competitive format. Those two facts had no relationship to each other, and the sale that converted the first fact into cash did nothing to address the second. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Willis Tower naming rights controversy of 2009 produced a specific cultural response that is forensically interesting, independent of its real estate implications. When Willis Group Holdings acquired the naming rights to what Chicago had known as the Sears Tower for 36 years, the public reaction in Chicago was disproportionate to the actual change involved. The building had not changed. Its height had not changed. Its architectural character had not changed. The skydeck had not changed. The view from the 103rd floor had not changed. What had changed was the name, and the name change produced a civic response that revealed, with unusual clarity, the degree to which the Sears Tower's identity in Chicago's cultural geography had become independent of the Sears Company, whose absence the name was supposed to still commemorate. Sears had vacated the building in 1992. The company had been declining competitively for 2 decades. The building had been renamed once already, informally, to simply the Tower, by a city that had been occupying and navigating around the structure for long enough to develop its own relationship with it that had nothing to do with the retail company that had commissioned it. The Willis Tower naming rights controversy was the moment at which Chicago articulated, through its collective resistance to the name change, that the building had become more important to the city's identity than the company that had built it ever was. That inversion is the denial architecture of this case. Not the denial of a specific financial reality by a specific ownership, but the collective denial of an entire city that preferred the institutional identity of a building whose builder had failed to the corporate identity of the insurance broker that had paid for the privilege of attaching its name to the structure. Chicago still calls it the Sears Tower. The Sears Company no longer exists in the form that built it. The building stands at 233 South Wacker Drive, housing tenants whose presence in the building has nothing to do with general merchandise retail, housing a skydeck that attracts millions of visitors annually, and carrying a name that the city it dominates largely refuses to use. Willis Tower, which Chicago still calls the Sears Tower, was sold in 2015 to a consortium led by Blackstone Group for approximately $1.3 billion, the largest single-asset commercial real estate transaction in Chicago history at that time. The Blackstone acquisition price of $1.3 billion, compared to the 1994 sale price of $850 million, documents the building's appreciation as a real estate asset across the 21 years between transactions. An appreciation that occurred while the company that had built the building was completing its transition from the largest retailer in the United States to a bankrupt shell whose remaining assets were in liquidation. The building appreciated. The company disintegrated. The two facts had no relationship to each other. What the Sears Tower case reveals in the context of this channel's 33-case archive is the specific forensic category of institutional monument, a building whose construction expressed the maximum confidence of the institution that commissioned it, and whose subsequent independent existence documents that institution's decline with greater precision than any financial report or court filing. Every previous case file in this archive has documented a building that was financially damaged by the failure of the institution it housed. The Sears Tower documents the reverse, a building that appreciated in value and expanded in cultural significance precisely during the period in which the institution that built it was experiencing its most severe and ultimately terminal competitive decline. The building did not fail because the company failed. The company's failure created the conditions under which the building could be owned and managed by entities that were better positioned to realize its value than the declining retailer had been. The world's tallest building was built by a company that was losing the most important competitive battle of its era at the moment of construction. The building outlasted the battle. The building outlasted the company. The building outlasted the name the company gave it, in the sense that Chicago refuses to use the new one. The Sears Tower is still there. Sears is not. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between institutional ambition and competitive reality in corporate headquarters development, subscribe to this channel, because the next case examines a headquarters whose construction expressed institutional ambition at the exact moment the institution's competitive reality was becoming indefensible. And in the comments, given Sears's documented competitive displacement by Walmart and Kmart in the years between the building's construction and its sale, what specific financial trigger should have prompted Sears to sell the building earlier, and what would earlier monetization have changed about the company's trajectory? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.